Cowboy took in a half-dead Apache child. Warriors blocked every road next morning. The relentless Arizona sun beat down on James Holden's weathered face as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon. 20 years on the frontier had carved deep lines around his eyes and grayed his once dark beard. But at 43, his frame remained lean and strong. The summer of 1878 had been particularly harsh, with drought scorching the land for miles around, turning creek beds to dust and killing cattle across the territory. James adjusted his worn Stetson, squinting at the horizon. He was 3 days out from his small ranch near Fort Bowie, returning from Tucson with supplies and a letter from his sister back in Missouri, a sister he hadn't seen in 15 years. The letter remained unopened in his saddlebag. Whatever news it contained could wait until he was home with a glass of whiskey. "Come on, Murphy," he muttered to his chestnut gelding. "Few more hours, and you'll have your oats." The horse's ears perked forward suddenly, and James felt the animal tense beneath him. Years of survival instinct kicked in immediately. James reached for the Winchester rifle in its scabbard, his eyes scanning the rocky slopes on either side of the trail. Apache country was never safe, especially not in recent months with tensions rising between the tribes and the army. But what caught his attention wasn't warriors on the ridge. It was the faint sound of labored breathing coming from behind a cluster of boulders ahead. James dismounted slowly, rifle in hand, and approached with caution. The sound grew clearer, ragged, shallow breaths punctuated by what might have been a whimper. He circled the boulders, rifle raised, then froze. A child lay curled on the ground, half hidden by scrub brush. An Apache boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, wearing a blood-soaked cotton shirt and deerskin leggings. Dark, matted hair framed a face contorted in pain. A deep gash ran across his forehead, and what looked like a bullet wound marked his upper arm. "Jesus Christ," James whispered, lowering his rifle. The boy's eyes fluttered open at the sound. Dark, fever-bright eyes filled with terror. He tried to scramble away, but collapsed with a sharp cry of pain. "Easy now," James said softly, though he knew the child likely didn't understand English. "I ain't gonna hurt you, boy." James glanced around, expecting to find dead parents or a raided wagon train, some explanation for an injured Apache child alone in the canyon. But there was nothing except dust, rock, and a vast, empty sky. Whatever violence had befallen the boy had happened elsewhere. He had 2 choices: leave the child to die, or take him. The first option would certainly be safer. Relations between settlers and the Apache had deteriorated to their worst point in years. Taking in an injured Apache child could be seen as kidnapping by the tribes, or as treason by some of the more hardened settlers. The boy's breathing grew more labored, his small chest rising and falling in irregular patterns. "God damn it," James muttered, holstering his rifle. He'd buried enough children on the frontier, including his own son, gone 10 years now to cholera. He wouldn't leave another die if he could help it. James knelt beside the boy, who flinched away despite his weakness. "I'm going to help you," he said, keeping his voice low and gentle, the way he'd speak to a spooked colt. "You understand? Help." He mimicked drinking water and pointed to the boy's wounds, then to his medical supplies on Murphy. The child's eyes, glassy with fever, followed James's movements. He didn't respond, but he didn't fight when James carefully lifted him. The boy weighed almost nothing, all skin and bone beneath the bloodied clothes. "Let's get you some water first," James said, carrying him to where Murphy waited. The horse snorted nervously at the scent of blood. "Easy, boy." James propped the child against a boulder and retrieved his canteen. The boy drank greedily when the water was offered, some of it spilling down his chin and neck, washing away streaks of dust and blood. "That's it. Not too fast now," James cautioned, though his words meant nothing to the child. After the boy had drunk his fill, James examined the wounds more carefully. The head gash was ugly, but not deep enough to be fatal. The bullet wound was more concerning. The ball had passed clean through the upper arm, but the wound was angry and hot to the touch. Infection setting in. James retrieved a small medicine kit from his saddlebags. He'd learned basic doctoring out of necessity, like most frontier men. He cleaned the wounds as best he could with whiskey from his flask, the boy hissing in pain, but remaining otherwise stoic, watching James with those dark, wary eyes. "You're a tough little warrior, ain't you?" James said as he bandaged the arm with strips of clean cloth. "Wonder what happened to your people?" He glanced around again at the empty canyon. "Don't matter now, I suppose." The decision made itself. James couldn't leave the boy, and the child was in no condition to travel far. He'd take him back to the ranch, treat his wounds properly, and figure out what to do after that. Perhaps once the boy recovered, he could be returned to his people somehow, though James knew that would be dangerous work. He fashioned a sling to secure the boy to his chest, mounted Murphy, and continued down the trail, now moving with greater urgency. The ranch was still several hours away, and the boy's fever was climbing. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in gold and crimson, James felt the small body against his chest shiver despite the heat. He wrapped his jacket around the child and urged Murphy to a faster pace. "Hang on, boy," he murmured. "Just hang on." The child said nothing, but his small hand clutched weakly at James's shirt, a gesture that stirred memories James had long tried to bury. His son, Samuel, had clutched at him the same way during his final hours. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, James caught sight of the silhouette of his small ranch house on the horizon. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The boy's breathing had grown shallow again, and his small body burned with fever. James rode hard for the last mile, Murphy's hooves kicking up dust that glowed orange in the last light of day. The familiar shape of the ranch house grew larger, a simple structure of adobe and timber with a small barn beside it. No wife waited to greet him. Clara had returned to her family in Kansas years ago, unable to bear the harshness of frontier life after Samuel's death. James had stayed, finding a strange comfort in the isolation and the routine of ranch work. As he approached the house, his dog, a rangy, half-wild mutt named Scout, came bounding out, barking excitedly. The noise startled the boy, who stirred against James's chest. "Quiet, Scout," James commanded, and the dog fell silent, watching curiously as his master dismounted, still cradling the child. Inside the sparse main room, James laid the boy on his own bed and lit the oil lamp on the nearby table. In the warm glow, the child looked even worse, his coppery skin ashen beneath the dirt and blood, his breathing labored. James worked quickly, heating water on the stove, cleaning the wounds more thoroughly, and brewing a tea of willow bark for the fever. The bullet wound showed clear signs of infection, the flesh around it swollen and hot. James had seen men die from less. He coaxed the bitter tea into the boy, who swallowed reflexively but remained largely unconscious. After applying a poultice of herbs to the wounds, a remedy learned from an old Shoshone woman years before, James covered the child with a light blanket and sat back in his chair, exhausted. What had he gotten himself into? Taking in an Apache child in the current climate was asking for trouble. If the boy's people came looking for him, they might assume James was responsible for his injuries. If the army or other settlers discovered the boy, they might accuse James of sympathizing with the hostiles. Yet as he watched the small chest rise and fall, James knew he couldn't have done otherwise. Whatever came next, he would face it. For now, the boy needed care, and James was the only one around to provide it. He moved his chair closer to the bed and settled in for a long night of vigil. Outside, the desert wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the house and carrying the distant howl of coyotes. James checked his rifle and pistol, placing them within easy reach, then turned his attention back to the fevered child. "You just keep breathing, boy," he said softly. "Just keep breathing." As midnight approached, the boy's fever spiked dangerously. James spent hours applying cool cloths to the burning forehead, murmuring reassurances that went unheard. When the child began to thrash and cry out in his native tongue, James held him gently, preventing him from tearing open his wounds. In the darkest hours before dawn, as James was beginning to fear the worst, the fever finally broke. The boy's breathing eased, and he fell into a more natural sleep. James, exhausted beyond measure, slumped in his chair but did not allow himself to sleep. Something told him that the real trouble was yet to come. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the single window, James stepped outside to tend to Murphy and scan the horizon. The empty desert stretched in all directions, seemingly peaceful in the early morning light. But James knew better than to trust the apparent calm. He had the distinct feeling that somewhere out there, eyes were watching and riders were coming. He returned inside to find the boy awake, those dark eyes now clear of fever and fixed intently on him. For a long moment, neither spoke, sizing each other up across a gulf of language and culture. Then James offered the only greeting he could think of, "Hungry?" The boy didn't respond verbally, but his eyes followed James's movements as the rancher moved to the stove and began preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush. As the food cooked, James brought a cup of water to the child, who took it cautiously with his uninjured arm. "My name's James," he said, pointing to himself. "James." The boy drank the water but remained silent, watchful. James served the mush in wooden bowls, adding a spoonful of precious molasses to each. He placed one bowl on the table near the bed and demonstrated eating from his own. After a moment's hesitation, the child struggled to sit up. James moved to help him, but stopped when the boy flinched away. Instead, he watched as the boy managed on his own, grimacing with pain but determined. Once upright, the child reached for the bowl with his good arm and began to eat ravenously. James smiled slightly. A good appetite was a promising sign. "Slow down there," he cautioned, mimicking more careful eating. "You'll make yourself sick." The boy seemed to understand the gesture and slowed his pace slightly. When he finished, he looked expectantly at James, who offered him more water. As James took the empty bowl, he noticed the boy studying the room, taking in the sparse furnishings, the rifle mounted on the wall, the few books on a crude shelf. His gaze lingered on a small wooden horse on the mantel, a toy James had carved for Samuel years ago and couldn't bring himself to part with. "That was my son's," James said, following the boy's gaze. "He's gone now." The child, of course, didn't understand the words, but something in James's tone made him look at the rancher's face, studying it with uncommon intensity for one so young. James was about to attempt more rudimentary communication when Scout began barking outside. Not the excited greeting from yesterday, but a warning. The hair on the back of James's neck stood up. "Stay here," he told the boy, making a staying motion with his hand. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, keeping to the side to avoid being seen. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least a dozen Apache warriors on horseback had formed a line across the trail leading to his ranch. They sat motionless in the distance, their very stillness a threat more potent than any charge. They had found him, or rather, they had found the boy, and now every road away from the ranch was blocked. James looked back at the child, who had tensed at Scout's barking. The boy met his gaze, and in that moment, James saw understanding dawn in those dark eyes. The child knew who waited outside. "Well, boy," James said grimly, checking his rifle. "Looks like we got company." The Apache warriors remained motionless on the horizon, silhouetted against the rising sun. James counted 14 of them, arranged in a wide semicircle that blocked the main trail to and from the ranch. Their patience was unnerving. They made no move to approach, no gesture of either peace or hostility. They simply waited, their presence a silent demand. James moved away from the window and knelt beside the bed where the boy sat rigid with tension. "Those your people out there?" James asked, knowing the question was futile but needing to fill the silence. He pointed toward the window and then to the boy. "Family." The child's eyes darted to the window, then back to James. For the first time since James had found him, the boy spoke, a single word in Apache that James couldn't understand, but the inflection suggested a question. James shook his head. "I don't speak your language, boy." The child frowned, then pointed to himself and said clearly, "Nijoni." James blinked in surprise, then nodded in understanding. "That your name?" "Nijoni." The boy nodded once, then pointed at James with a questioning look. "James," he replied, tapping his own chest. James Holden. Zames, Najoni attempted, the unfamiliar sound awkward on his tongue. Despite the tense situation, James felt a smile tug at his lips. Close enough. Scout's renewed barking drew his attention back to the window. One of the warriors had separated from the group and was riding slowly toward the ranch. A lance with what appeared to be a white cloth tied to it held high. Looks like they want to talk, James muttered. He glanced back at Najoni. They come for you, I expect. The boy had edged closer to the window, though he still couldn't see outside from his position on the bed. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his small frame was evident. James made a decision. He couldn't hide the boy, and attempting to flee would only end badly. His only option was to face whatever came next with as much dignity and honesty as he could muster. Stay here, he told Najoni, making the staying motion again. I'm going out to talk to them. The boy's eyes widened, and he shook his head vehemently, suddenly grabbing James's arm with surprising strength for one so injured. Choke on, Najoni said urgently, his dark eyes intense. Choke on Niles. James didn't understand the words, but the warning was clear. I have to, boy. Can't hide in here forever. He gently detached the child's grip and moved to the door. He propped his rifle beside it, within reach, but not in hand. Appearing armed would send the wrong message. Before stepping outside, he looked back at Najoni, who watched him with a mixture of fear and resignation. It'll be all right, James said, not believing it himself, but needing to offer some reassurance. The morning air was already warm as James stepped onto his small porch. Scout stood at attention beside him, hackles raised but silent now. The approaching warrior was about 50 yards away, moving at a deliberate pace. James could see now that he was an older man, his face deeply lined, his long hair streaked with gray. He wore a simple cotton shirt and buckskin leggings, with a knife at his belt, but no other visible weapons. James stepped off the porch and moved into the open yard, hands held slightly away from his sides to show he was unarmed. He stopped and waited as the warrior approached. The Apache rider halted his pony about 10 paces from James. Up close, the man's face was even more weathered than it had appeared from a distance, with piercing black eyes that seemed to look through James rather than at him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, James broke the silence. I mean no harm. The boy's inside. He's hurt, but he's alive. The warrior studied him impassively, then spoke in heavily accented but clear English. I am Natan. Why you take Apache, boy? James was surprised by the direct communication, but tried not to show it. I found him yesterday, in the canyon about 20 miles south. He was badly hurt, shot in the arm, cut on the head. I couldn't leave him to die. Natan's expression didn't change. You army man? No. James shook his head. I'm just a rancher. Live here alone. The warrior's eyes flicked to the house behind James, then back to his face. Boy is Key Narbona's son. He is dead now. Army men kill him 2 days ago. James felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The army had been conducting operations against hostile Apache bands recently, but he'd heard no details of engagements. I'm sorry to hear that. Was the boy with his father when it happened? Natan nodded once. Many die. Boy run away in fighting. We search, think maybe he dead too. His gaze hardened. Then we hear white man take Apache child. I was trying to help him, James said, keeping his voice level. He was hurt, fevered. Wouldn't have survived the night without care. Natan was silent for a moment, his eyes never leaving James's face. You get boy back now. It wasn't a request, and James knew it. He nodded slowly. Of course. But he's still weak, his arm is badly hurt. He needs rest, proper care. We take care of our own, Natan replied, a hint of pride and perhaps anger in his tone. James couldn't argue with that. He turned slightly toward the house. He's inside. I'll get him. No. Natan raised a hand. I come too. See how boy is. James hesitated, then nodded. All right, but just you. Tell your men to stay where they are. Natan turned in his saddle and made a series of hand gestures to the waiting warriors. Then he dismounted in one fluid motion that belied his age and stood before James, slightly shorter but carrying himself with unmistakable dignity. Lead way, he said. James called Scout to heel and led Nat into the house. As they stepped inside, James saw Najoni had managed to get himself to the edge of the bed, his small feet touching the floor as if he'd been preparing to stand. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of Natan, and a flood of words in Apache spilled from his lips. Natan responded in kind, his tone gentler than it had been with James. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Najoni occasionally gesturing toward his bandaged arm or at James. Natan listened intently, his weathered face giving away nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he turned to James. Boy says you save him. Clean wounds, give medicine, food. There was a question in his eyes, though he didn't voice it. James shrugged uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same. Natan's expression suggested he very much doubted that. He say bullet was white man's. Army men shoot him when he run. James felt a surge of anger at the thought of soldiers firing on a fleeing child, but he kept his expression neutral. His arm will heal with time and care. The infection was my biggest worry, but the fever broke last night. Natan moved to examine Najoni more closely, gently unwrapping the bandage on his arm to inspect the wound. He nodded approvingly at what he saw, then rewrapped it with practiced hands. You use good medicine, he acknowledged. But boy must come with us now. His mother's sister waits. She is heartbroken, thinking him dead like his father. James nodded. He had known this moment would come, yet he felt an unexpected reluctance to see the boy go. In just one day, Najoni had awakened memories and emotions long buried. Let me gather some supplies for him, James said. Food, clean bandages, medicine for the pain. Natan hesitated, then nodded. As James moved around the small house, collecting items, he could hear Natan speaking softly to Najoni in their language. The boy responded in short phrases, his voice stronger than James would have expected. When James had packed a small bundle of supplies, he approached the bed. Najoni looked up at him, his dark eyes solemn. Looks like you're going home, boy, James said, forcing a smile. Your aunt's waiting for you. Najoni said something to Natan, who translated. He asked why you help him when other white men try to kill him. James knelt to meet the boy's eyes. Not all men are the same, Najoni. White, Apache, Mexican. There are good and bad among all people. He wasn't sure how much of this Natan would translate or how much the boy would understand, but he felt compelled to say it nonetheless. I helped you because you needed help. That's all. After Natan translated, Najoni studied James's face intently. Then, to James's surprise, the boy reached out with his good arm and touched James's weathered cheek, as if confirming he was real. Ehi, Najoni said softly. He say thank you. Natan explained, though the meaning had been clear enough. James nodded, unexpectedly moved. You're welcome, boy. You take care of that arm now. Natan spoke again to Najoni, who nodded. Then the warrior turned to James. I will carry him. His leg also hurt, though not bad. James stepped back as Natan gently lifted Najoni. The boy was small for his age, and the warrior held him with ease. As they moved toward the door, Najoni looked over Natan's shoulder at James, his expression a mixture of gratitude and something else, perhaps understanding beyond his years. James followed them outside, where Natan's pony waited patiently. With surprising gentleness, the warrior lifted Najoni onto the horse's back, then mounted behind him, securing the boy against his chest much as James had done the day before. The other Apache warriors remained on the horizon, still and watchful. What will happen now? James asked, looking from Najoni to Natan. With your people, I mean. Natan's face hardened. We fight. What else? Army kill our men, take our land, starve our children. He glanced down at Najoni. But this one he live. That is something. James couldn't argue with the warrior's assessment. The situation between the Apache and the U.S. government had been deteriorating for years, with broken treaties, corrupt Indian agents, and military campaigns pushing the native peoples to the edge of survival. There has to be another way, James said, though he knew his words were meaningless in the face of such realities. Natan looked at him with something like pity. You are different, maybe, but your people. He shook his head. Too much blood now. Too much hate. He was right, James knew. The cycle of violence had spun too far to be easily stopped. Still, he felt compelled to offer something, some small gesture in a sea of hostility. If Najoni ever needs help again, or any of your people, this place isn't much, but my door is open. Natan studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether the offer was genuine. Finally, he gave a slight nod. I will remember. He glanced at the horizon, then back at James. You should go soon. Army patrol comes this way sometimes. The warning was unexpected, and James nodded his thanks. I'll keep that in mind. Natan gathered his reins, preparing to depart, but Najoni said something to him, gesturing urgently. The warrior paused, then looked at James. Boy wants to give you something. Najoni reached beneath his shirt and pulled out a small object on a leather cord around his neck. With some difficulty due to his injured arm, he lifted it over his head and held it out to James. It was a small stone amulet, smooth and dark, with simple markings etched into its surface. James hesitated. I can't take that, boy. Must be important to you. Natan translated, and Najoni insisted, pushing the amulet toward James. It is protection, Natan explained. His grandfather make it. Boy says it will keep bad spirits away. James was deeply touched by the gesture. Carefully, he accepted the small token. Tell him I'll keep it safe. After Natan translated, Najoni nodded solemnly, seemingly satisfied. Then the warrior turned his pony and began riding back toward the waiting Apache. James watched them go, the small figure of Najoni still visible against Natan's larger frame. As they rejoined the other warriors, the entire group began to move away, fading into the landscape like shadows retreating before the sun. Within minutes, they had disappeared from view, leaving only dust and the vast emptiness of the desert. James stood for a long time, the stone amulet warm in his palm, Scout sitting patiently beside him. The encounter had ended peacefully, which was more than he had dared hope. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly an ending at all, but rather the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand. Eventually, he slipped the leather cord over his head, letting the amulet rest against his chest. Then he turned back to his empty house, already seeming more silent than it had before Najoni's brief presence. As he stepped inside, James noticed the small wooden horse from the mantel lying on the bed where Najoni had been. The boy must have managed to reach it while James wasn't looking. But rather than taking it, Najoni had left it, a gift in exchange for the amulet, perhaps, or simply a reminder that he had been there. James picked up the toy, memories of Samuel flooding back. After a moment's contemplation, he placed it back on the mantel. Then he sat heavily in his chair, suddenly exhausted from the tension of the morning. The day stretched before him, empty of purpose. He should check the cattle, repair the fence on the north pasture, all the mundane tasks of ranch life that had occupied his days before. Yet he found himself reluctant to return to that routine, as if something fundamental had shifted during Najoni's brief stay. Finally, he remembered the letter from his sister, still unopened in his saddlebag. He retrieved it and broke the seal, unfolding the pages covered in his sister's neat handwriting. As he began to read, he absently touched the stone amulet around his neck, a tangible reminder of the small Apache boy who had unexpectedly entered and left his life in the span of a single day, leaving an impression far deeper than the brief encounter should have allowed. Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying dust and the promise of change. 3 weeks passed in a blur of routine for James. The letter from his sister had contained an invitation to visit Missouri in the fall, along with news of family members he barely remembered and a gentle suggestion that it was time he considered leaving the frontier behind. He had set the letter aside without replying, uncertain what answer to give. The days grew hotter as July stretched toward August, the sun baking the land until the very air seemed to shimmer with heat. James worked from dawn till dusk, pushing himself beyond exhaustion, mending fences, tending cattle, repairing the windmill that drew water from the deep well near the house. The physical labor kept his body occupied, but his mind continued to drift to the Apache boy and the brief, strange encounter with Natan. James had heard rumors in town of increased military activity to the south. Fort Bowie had received reinforcements, and patrols had been stepped up along the border with Mexico. The storekeeper mentioned a skirmish between soldiers and hostiles near the Dragoon Mountains, with casualties on both sides. James listened but didn't volunteer any information about his own encounter with the Apache. Trust was a scarce commodity on the frontier, and he had no desire to explain his actions to suspicious neighbors or overzealous army officers. The stone amulet remained around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. Sometimes in the evenings, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, he would take it out and trace the simple markings with his thumb, wondering about Najoni, whether the boy's arm was healing properly, whether he still remembered the rancher who had tended his wounds. It was on such an evening, nearly a month after Najoni had left with Natan, that James noticed a dust cloud on the horizon. He straightened in his chair, reaching instinctively for the rifle that always stood nearby. Scout, dozing at his feet, raised his head and growled low in his throat. The approaching riders were still too distant to identify, but James could tell by the formation that it was a military patrol. 6 men riding in an orderly column rather than the loose grouping typical of civilians or the scattered approach of Apache warriors. "Looks like we got company, Scout," James muttered, setting aside his coffee cup. The dog stood, hackles raised, sensing his master's tension. James remained on the porch as the patrol approached, his rifle visible but not aimed. As they drew closer, he could make out the blue uniforms of the cavalry, dusty from the trail but unmistakable. The officer leading them rode a large bay gelding, his posture rigid even after what must have been a long day in the saddle. The patrol halted in the yard, and the officer raised a hand in greeting. "Evening, Mr. Holden." James nodded cautiously. "Lieutenant, what brings the army to my doorstep?" Lieutenant Carter Preston was a young officer, perhaps 30, with a neatly trimmed mustache and hard eyes that had seen too much frontier violence. James had met him a few times in town and found him to be efficient but inflexible, a dangerous combination in Apache country. "Routine patrol," Preston replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Mind if we water our horses? Been a long ride from the fort." "Help yourself." James gestured toward the water trough near the barn. "There's coffee on the stove if your men are interested." Preston dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. "Just me if you don't mind. Have a few questions I'd like to ask." The other soldiers led the horses to the trough, while Preston followed James into the house. Inside, the lieutenant removed his hat, revealing close-cropped brown hair, and glanced around the sparse interior with undisguised curiosity. James poured 2 cups of coffee and set one before Preston, who remained standing. "What sort of questions, Lieutenant?" Preston took a sip of coffee before answering. "Been some reports of Apache movements in this area. More than usual. Thought you might have noticed something being out here on your own." James shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "Can't say that I have. Been busy with the ranch. Don't get out much beyond my own property." Preston studied him with those hard eyes. "That's so, because we tracked a rather large party of Apache through this area about 3 weeks back. Trail led right to your doorstep, then scattered. Found that mighty interesting." A cold weight settled in James's stomach, but he maintained his calm demeanor. "Lots of Apache in these parts, Lieutenant. They pass through all the time. Don't usually stop to introduce themselves." "Usually no," Preston agreed, setting down his cup. "But these ones did, didn't they, Holden?" James met the officer's gaze steadily. "What exactly are you asking me, Lieutenant?" Preston's expression hardened. "There was an engagement near the Dragoon Mountains a month ago. Apache band led by a troublemaker named Key Narbona. We killed several warriors, including Narbona himself, but some escaped. Among them was Narbona's son, a boy of about 7 or 8. He paused, watching James intently. A boy who was wounded in the fighting. James felt his heart rate increase, but kept his face impassive. "I don't see what this has to do with me." "Don't you?" Preston began to pace slowly around the small room. 3 days after the engagement, a large party of Apache warriors was seen converging on this ranch. They stayed for less than an hour, then departed. And you expect me to believe they were just passing through? Believe what you want, James replied, his voice cooling. I've got no quarrel with the Apache, and they've got none with me. We leave each other be. Preston stopped at the mantel, his gaze falling on Samuel's wooden horse. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Interesting philosophy out here in hostile territory. He set the toy down and turned back to James. Especially for a man who lost his wife to Comanche raiders back in '67. The reference to his past sent a jolt through James. It had been the Comanche, not the Apache, who had attacked the wagon train James and Clara had been traveling with on their way west. Clara had survived, but was never the same afterward, the trauma driving her back east years later after Samuel's death. You've done your research, James said coldly, but you've got your tribes mixed up, and that was a lifetime ago. Preston shrugged. Indians are Indians, and a man who's lost family to them doesn't usually develop such a tolerant attitude. He fixed James with a hard stare. Unless he has reason to. Like harboring a wounded Apache child, perhaps. James set his coffee cup down with deliberate calm. That's a serious accusation, Lieutenant. Got any proof to back it up? Not yet, Preston admitted. But I will. One of my scouts found signs of a child's blood on the trail leading to your property. And a local trader mentioned you bought extra medical supplies in town recently. He smiled thinly. Small details, but they add up. I cut myself repairing the windmill, James countered. Needed stitches and fresh bandages. Ask Doc Miller if you don't believe me. The lie came easily, though James knew it wouldn't hold up to serious scrutiny. Doc Miller hadn't seen him in months. Preston seemed about to respond when a commotion outside drew their attention. One of the soldiers appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. Lieutenant, riders approaching from the south. Looks like Apache. Preston's hand moved to his sidearm. How many? Just two, sir. One appears to be wounded. James felt a surge of alarm. Apache approaching openly in daylight, with a cavalry patrol present? It made no sense unless the situation was desperate. Preston strode to the door, James close behind him. In the fading evening light, two riders were visible about a quarter-mile away, moving slowly toward the ranch. Even at this distance, James could see that the lead rider was supporting the second, who slumped forward in the saddle. Form up. Preston ordered his men, who quickly mounted their horses and arranged themselves in a defensive line. Holden, get inside. James ignored the command, straining to see the approaching riders more clearly. As they drew nearer, a shock of recognition hit him. The lead rider was Naten, and the wounded figure he supported was smaller, much smaller. Hold your fire, James called out as Preston raised his arm to signal his men. That's just an old man and a child. Preston shot him a suspicious glance, but lowered his arm. Stay alert, he told his men. Could be a trap. James stepped forward, moving past the line of soldiers despite Preston's warning growl. As Naten approached, James could see blood staining the front of his shirt, not his own but from the child he held. And the child was Nijoni. Naten reined in his horse about 20 feet from the soldiers, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes revealing recognition when they fell on James. He spoke a single word, help. James moved forward immediately, but Preston grabbed his arm. Stay where you are. Holden, this is Army business now. That boy is dying, James said, jerking his arm free. You want his blood on your hands, too? The words struck home. Preston's jaw tightened, but he released James's arm. 5 minutes. Then we take them in. James approached Naten, who carefully lowered Nijoni into his arms. The boy was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his shirt soaked with blood from a wound in his chest. What happened? James asked, carrying Nijoni quickly toward the house. Naten dismounted and followed, his normally stoic expression cracked with worry. Army attack our camp at dawn. Many die. Nijoni hurt bad. No medicine woman left. He glanced back at the soldiers with undisguised hatred. I bring him here because you helped before. No other place to go. Inside the house, James laid Nijoni on the bed and quickly cut away his blood-soaked shirt. The wound was a bullet hole just below the right collarbone, perilously close to the lung. There was no exit wound, meaning the ball was still inside. He needs a doctor, James said, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. I can't get a bullet out, not one this deep. Naten stood rigid beside the bed, his eyes never leaving Najoni's pale face. No doctor will help Apache boy. The army surgeon might, James said, though he doubted it himself. Military doctors were primarily concerned with their own wounded. Preston appeared in the doorway, his hand resting on his holster. "Time's up, Holden. We're taking them in." James straightened, positioning himself between Preston and the bed. "This boy will die if he's moved. The bullet's still in him, too deep for me to reach." "Not my problem," Preston replied coldly. "He's Apache, probably the son of the warrior who killed 3 of my men last month." "He's a child," James countered, his voice rising. "No more than 8 years old. What kind of man leaves a child to die?" Preston's expression didn't change. "The kind who's buried too many good men killed by Apache raiders. The kind who's seen what they do to settlers. Men, women, and children." His gaze shifted to Naten. "The old man comes with us now. The boy can stay until he's stable enough to travel. Then he joins his friend at the fort." Naten spoke before James could respond. "I stay with boy." "Not an option," Preston said flatly. "You're a prisoner of war now." James saw the tension in Naten's body, the subtle shift of weight that suggested he was preparing to fight or flee. If either happened, blood would be shed, Naten's and probably Najoni's too, when the confusion spread. "Lieutenant," James said, deliberately softening his tone, "I give you my word the old man won't leave my property. Post a guard if you need to. But that boy needs someone who speaks his language, who can comfort him." He met Preston's gaze steadily. "You're a military man. You know the value of morale and healing." Preston hesitated, clearly torn between his duty and the humanitarian appeal. Finally, he nodded curtly. "One night, I'll leave Corporal Davis to stand guard. At dawn, the old man comes with us, regardless of the boy's condition." He looked pointedly at James. "And you'll answer some questions about your relationship with these Apache, Holden. Count on it." After issuing instructions to Corporal Davis, a young soldier with a nervous demeanor but steady hands, Preston and the rest of the patrol departed, heading back toward Fort Bowie. James knew they would return, probably with more men and more questions than he could safely answer. For now, though, his concern was Najoni. The boy's condition was deteriorating rapidly, his breathing becoming more labored, his skin taking on a grayish pallor. "We need to get that bullet out," James told Naten, gathering his medical supplies. "But I'm no surgeon. It's risky." Naten nodded gravely. "No choice. I help." From the doorway, Corporal Davis watched with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "I should report this," he muttered, more to himself than to James. "Report what?" James challenged, laying out his tools. A sharp knife, forceps, whiskey for disinfectant, clean cloths. "That we're trying to save a child's life?" "Go ahead." The young soldier shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. James gave Najoni a small amount of laudanum mixed with water, not enough to fully anesthetize him, but hopefully enough to dull the worst of the pain. Then, with Naten holding the boy still, James began the delicate process of probing for the bullet. It was gruesome work. Najoni, despite the laudanum, cried out in pain, his small body arching against Naten's restraining hands. James worked as quickly as he dared, sweat beading on his forehead as he searched for the lead ball lodged somewhere in the boy's chest. After what seemed an eternity, the forceps closed around something solid. "Got it," James muttered, carefully extracting the misshapen bullet. Blood welled from the wound, but less than he had feared. The ball had missed the major vessels. Working quickly, James cleaned the wound with whiskey, packed it with a poultice of herbs, and bandaged it tightly. Throughout the ordeal, Naten spoke softly to Najoni in Apache, his weathered hand gripping the boy's small one, his voice a steady anchor in a sea of pain. When it was done, Najoni lay unconscious but breathing more easily. The immediate danger had passed, though infection remained a significant risk. James sat back, exhausted, his hands stained with blood. "He's strong," he told Naten. "He has a chance." Naten nodded once, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. But he did not release Najoni's hand, and his eyes never left the boy's face. From his position by the door, Corporal Davis cleared his throat. "That was well done," he said awkwardly, Didn't think the little fellow would make it. James glanced at the young soldier with new interest. Perhaps there was an ally here, or at least not an enemy. He's not out of danger yet. The next few hours will tell. As night fell, James prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. He offered portions to both Natan and Davis, who accepted with varying degrees of reluctance. Natan ate little, most of his attention focused on Najoni, who drifted in and out of consciousness. After the meal, Davis took up his post outside the door, promising to check in periodically. James suspected the young corporal was more concerned with giving them privacy than with maintaining strict vigilance, a small kindness he appreciated. Alone with Natan and the sleeping Najoni, James finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Why did you bring him here? Surely there are other Apache who could have helped. Natan was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. Our band scattered after attack. Some go north, some south. Many dead. He looked down at Najoni. Boy asked for you. Say white man with kind eyes will help. The simple answer struck James deeply. I'm just one man. I can't change what's happening to your people. One man is all it takes, sometimes, Natan replied, with surprising philosophy. Like small stone that starts avalanche. James considered this, absently touching the stone amulet beneath his shirt. The lieutenant will be back tomorrow with more men. They'll take you to the fort as a prisoner. And when Najoni is strong enough, they'll take him too. Natan nodded, unsurprised. I know. Then why come here at all? Why not flee south to Mexico? The old warrior looked at him steadily. Because boy would die before we reach border. Because you have medicine, knowledge. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. And because sometimes enemy of my enemy is friend. James understood. By bringing Najoni here, Natan had placed the boy under the protection of a white man, a status that might shield him from the worst of the Army's treatment. It was a desperate gamble, but perhaps the only one available. What will happen to him at the fort? James asked, though he feared he knew the answer. Natan's expression darkened. They will put him with other captured children. Send him to school in East, teach him to forget Apache ways, forget his language, his people. The warrior's hands clenched. Kill his spirit, if not his body. It was true. The government's policy of civilizing native children by removing them from their tribes and sending them to distant boarding schools was well known, though rarely discussed openly. The thought of vibrant, resilient Najoni subjected to such a fate was deeply troubling. There has to be another way, James said, echoing his words from their first meeting. Natan looked at him thoughtfully. Perhaps there is, but it would require great risk. What do you mean? The warrior leaned forward, lowering his voice though Davis was outside and couldn't hear them. You could take boy, claim him as ward. White man's law might allow this. James was stunned by the suggestion. The Army would never agree. And your people? My people are dying, Natan interrupted, his voice harsh with suppressed emotion. Our ways, our lands, all being taken. Boy has no mother, no father now. Better he lives with one who respects our ways than with those who would destroy them. The proposal was so unexpected, so fraught with complications, that James could only stare at Natan in astonishment. You would trust me with him? After everything my people have done to yours. Natan held his gaze steadily. I trust you, James Holden, not your people. Before James could respond, Najoni stirred, murmuring something in Apache. Natan immediately turned his attention to the boy, speaking softly, offering water from a cup beside the bed. James watched them, his mind racing with the implications of Natan's suggestion. To claim guardianship of an Apache child would invite suspicion, hostility, perhaps even violence from both sides of the frontier divide. Yet the alternative, allowing Najoni to be taken to a government school, where his heritage would be systematically erased, seemed equally unacceptable. And beneath these practical considerations lay a deeper truth that James had been avoiding. In the brief time he had known Najoni, the boy had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Samuel's death, a sense of purpose, of connection, of hope. I'll need to think about this, James said finally. There are many factors to consider. Natan nodded, seeming neither surprised nor disappointed by the non-committal response. Dawn comes soon. Think quickly. Outside, the desert night had deepened, stars blazing in the vast blackness above. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to one another, their eerie voices carrying on the still air. Inside the small ranch house, three people from vastly different worlds have been drawn together by circumstance and choice, their futures now inextricably linked by decisions yet to be made. James moved to check Najoni's bandages, his mind still grappling with Natan's unexpected proposal. The boy's fever was mild, a good sign, and his breathing remained steady. As James adjusted the blanket covering him, Najoni's eyes fluttered open, focusing on James with surprising clarity. "James," he whispered, the name still awkward on his tongue. "I'm here, boy," James replied softly. "You're going to be all right." Najoni's small hand moved to touch the front of James's shirt, where the stone amulet lay hidden. "Go-we," he said, a question in his tone. James glanced at Natan for translation. "He asks if you still have protection stone," the warrior explained. James nodded, pulling the amulet out to show Najoni. "I keep it with me always." The boy smiled faintly, then spoke again in Apache. Natan translated. "He says stone works. Brought him back to you when he needed help." Something tightened in James's chest, a mixture of emotion he couldn't quite name. "Rest now," he told Najoni, gently squeezing his hand. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." As the boy drifted back to sleep, James moved to the window, staring out at the star-filled sky. The decision before him was perhaps the most consequential he had faced since leaving Missouri all those years ago. Whatever choice he made would irrevocably alter the course of his life and Najoni's. Dawn was still hours away, but already James could feel time pressing upon him, urging him toward a resolution he was not yet certain he could embrace. Yet as he turned back to look at the sleeping child, something shifted within him, a clarity emerging from the tumult of conflicting thoughts and fears. Perhaps, as Natan had suggested, one man could indeed start an avalanche. Perhaps the path forward lay not in grand gestures or sweeping changes, but in a single decision to stand against the tide of history and hatred. James touched the stone amulet, its smooth surface warm against his fingers. Outside, the coyotes had fallen silent, and the desert held its breath, waiting for dawn.